Good morning. We are back on the record. The time is 9 a.m. The date is October 30th, 2024, and this is day 2 of the public hearing in docket number 2023.08.076 involving the application of Northwestern Energy to update QF-1 tariff rates and terms. The commission and its staff are appearing from Helena, Montana in the Bollinger Room of the Montana Public Service Commission. I would note that we have Commissioner Pinocci, myself, and Commissioner Bukacek appearing here in the room. And then we have Commissioner O'Donnell and President Brown joining us again today online. Mr. Chandler, you may proceed with your case in chief.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good morning. I call Mr. Erling Jewell to the stand. Good morning, Erling. How are you doing today?
Good morning.
Can you please state and spell your name?
My name is Erling Jewell. The first name is E-R-L-I-N-G. Last name is J-U-E-L.
And who are you employed by and in what capacity?
I'm employed by Greenfields Irrigation District, and I am the district manager.
And did you submit pre-filed testimony in this docket?
I did.
Do you have that testimony before you?
I do.
Is the name of that testimony pre-filed intervener testimony of Erling A. Jewell, P.E., on behalf of Greenfields Irrigation District and Hydrodynamics, Inc.?
That is correct.
And was it submitted on February 8th, 2024?
And I have no idea.
Subject to check, was it submitted on February 8th, 2024?
That sounds about right.
Do you have any corrections to your testimony?
I do not.
And if I were to ask you the same questions here today, would your responses be the same?
Yes, they would.
Madam Chair, I move to admit the stated testimony and accompanying attachments as Exhibit QF-1.
No objection.
No objection.
Thank you. QF-1 is admitted.
And Mr. Jewell, can you explain why Greenfields felt that it was important to intervene in this docket?
Why it's important to be an intervener? Is that? I guess just to start with, the QF process is very important to Greenfields Irrigation District. We are blessed with quite a bit of topographical relief across our district, and we are also in need of replacing a lot of critical infrastructure. That allows us to convert some of our structures into energy producing structures that capture the energy of the falling water. And the revenue stream is very important to the district, not only for the current producers, but also, future producers yet to be born. Just so the longevity and sustainability of the districts is very important, and the QF process is very, very important. Why we're intervening is it's clear. I've been watching I've become familiar with the PURPA process, and the PURPA facilitates and provides a vehicle for GID to convert some of these structures into energy producing components, and which is good for the district. But it is clear that Northwestern Energy doesn't like the QF process. They don't want to buy the energy from the QFs. Small QFs in particular are a nuisance. And so in essence, I think they're at war with QFs. And So we're here because the QF process is important to the district. We have one structure under construction today. We have one on deck, another 3 megawatt site on deck. And then we have a larger facility after that that's in the hole. And so why we're intervening is because we're here to protect the QF process in the long run. The current effort by Northwestern is, the proposed changes are, in my opinion, are egregious. And it would be the death knell for QFs, especially small QFs. And so we're here to join the fight to try and save the process. Did that answer your question?
Thank you, Mr. Jewell. I would tender this witness for cross.
Ms. Hill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning, Mr. Jewell.
Good morning, Counselor.
You testify that the revenue stream that GID will receive from Northwestern's customers is very important. And you were present yesterday at this hearing and heard all the testimony, correct?
That is correct.
Counsel for the QFs asked several questions about the treatment of Northwestern's non-QF resources. Do you recommend that this commission treat QFs the same way they treat non-QF generators?
Well, I think PURPA allows, special treatment for QFs. That's why it was set up. At certain levels, there has to be fairness, but at certain levels, the QFs have to be recognized under the Act and the mini PURPA, the state regulations that actually promote QFs.
Do you agree to the commission reevaluating your rates every few years as part of a full audit of your books and records?
As far as the rates that we would be receiving from the power that's being generated?
Correct.
For a small QF, I don't think that's the right way to go.
Do you agree to allow the commission to audit the construction costs of all your projects to see if these costs were reasonable?
I don't see any problem with that.
And if the commission determines your costs were not reasonable, do you agree to changing the rates that you received in your contract?
Well, I don't. I think the process, when we started down this road, Counselor, there was avoided cost rates and there was a standard QF agreement in place. And that's what basically moved us down the path of converting our structures into generating facilities. And now the process to change that. And again, I'm sorry to say this, but it goes back to my opinion that Northwestern is at odds with QFs, and they're stuck with PURPA, they're stuck with state statutes, and their only course of action is to attack the feasibility of QFs. So I think if you have avoided cost structure over the life of the PPA, that is the best thing for a small QF, definitely.
It's your testimony that if the QF defaults on the PPA and doesn't meet the terms of the PPA, then it doesn't have to repay, or it doesn't have to pay a replacement price for that capacity, correct?
That's not quite true. What I'm saying, Counselor, is if for whatever reason we fail to produce electricity in terms of the contract, that if there are damages, that the GID should be responsible for them. And I'm talking about real damages. I'm not talking about penalties. So, for example, if we fail to produce electricity, you're not going to pay us for that. So that revenue does not come to us. That revenue stays with Northwestern because we didn't produce any electricity for you to pay. Then, that would then go to buy power on the open market. If the price of power is incrementally more that would be a damage. And I don't have any problem with the district paying, if something happens to our system, we're failed to produce electricity and it costs more to procure energy on the open market, then that is an actual damage. But if it costs less, then shouldn't the district receive a credit? Because now you're buying the same energy for less?
So you agree then that we don't need to entirely delete the concept of replacement price from the contract?
I think that those are terms that still could be negotiated. Again, I'm not trying to skirt GID's responsibilities. And if there are real damages, we should be held accountable. But I don't think we should be subject to penalties and damages that aren't real.
You recommend that the definition of network upgrades in the QF tariff be the same as the definition in Northwestern's open access transmission tariff, correct?
I'm not sure. I'd have to refresh my testimony.
Could you turn to page 25 of your testimony?
All right, what page?
The top of page 25.
The first question there.
At the top of page 25, don't you say GID is unclear why Northwestern's FERC approved definition under its open access transmission tariff would not apply in this docket?
That is true. I'm sorry. I have to go back and look at my notes when this was first prepared. But that's true. That's what it's saying.
So you agree with using the definition in the open access transmission tariff or OAT for network upgrades for transmission service?
Well, I'm not sure that I'm legally allowed to answer that question. I mean, I would have to consult with, but what I agreed to here in my testimony is what it says.
Do you agree with using the definition in the OAT for network upgrades for interconnection?
I'm not totally familiar what that definition is.
Do you agree that QFs are responsible for their proportional share of network upgrades?
I believe that there's a cost for connecting to Northwestern system, that there should be a fair way to look at that, and there should be some cost sharing. But I was also under the impression that there was allowances for repayment back for when a QF is improving the utilities distribution system because of growth, because of need, that there would then be reimbursement back to that QF to compensate for those developments. That's what I understand in the past.
Isn't it true that Greenfield's irrigation district does not interconnect to Northwestern system?
That is not true. I mean, currently we have a 14 megawatt facility, which we're 10% owners of, and GID owns the transmission line that joins Turnbull to Northwestern's transmission line, and we do connect directly to that. Our current site, our current 3 megawatt site that is under construction would not connect physically to Northwestern's site.
Isn't it true that for the past 20 years, some portion of Montana has experienced drought?
Yes, I have been somewhat active in the governor's drought advisory board and have saw those trends, that varies, of course, from year to year, and the severity varies from year to year. So that is true.
Wasn't about a third of the state under drought conditions in 2021?
Again, conditions, there's various stages of drought. And so if you're just saying, did they have any drought status at all, that would probably be true. I think when you say the severity of the drought, then a lot of that area would probably drop off.
So if you're just using the word drought, then you agree it's a regularly occurring characteristic of Montana's climate.
It is, can be. I mean, obviously, the severe drought, when you talk, and I assume you're talking about the force majeure issues with the wording of drought.
Yes.
They also mention flood and earthquakes, which also have various degrees of occurrence. We experience flooding probably every couple of years. Some of it's very minor, some of it can be more severe. I think flooding, earthquakes, so on and so forth are all various degrees. And I don't think force majeure goes in and says, this level of flood is okay, this level of flood then triggers force majeure. I think the drought, yeah, it's a condition that should be recognized and added to the force majeure condition. How it's described and labeled and what level it triggers. If you're going to create something, then you need to create something for flood, earthquakes, terrorism, acts of war, and so on.
But it's fair to say there should be reasonable guardrails around all those terms, right?
There should be.
And you didn't propose any though, did you?
There wasn't any proposed for any of the other terms.
Could you return to your exhibit 2? That's your proposed PPA. And refer to section 5.4.1, please.
Ms. Hill, can you repeat the section?
Section 5.4.1, it's on page 12 of the PPA in Mr. Jewell's testimony.
I am there.
At the end of section 5.4.1, you added the language that's underlined in effect as of the effective date of this agreement, correct?
Well, that's obviously with the understanding that we're going to put those rates that were triggered when we established Leo would be incorporated into this document.
Did you add any language in there about a legally enforceable obligation or Leo?
Well, I don't believe I can go into this document without having first established Leo. I'm not an attorney, but.
So do you agree to pay the rates in effect as of the effective date of the agreement?
Well, and again, we're going to put those rates in there, I assume, as an exhibit.
Are you going to follow the tariff?
Objection. This is a legal question. And the question of how the LEO applies a QF-1 situation is inherently a legal question. And I would also note that this is dealing with the standard PPA proposed in this docket. It's meant to be an off-the-shelf PPA. QF-1s in the future, once this is set up, take it off the shelf and sign it. So it's not applicable to currently under construction projects.
Madam Chair, I don't think any party wants to take a contract off the shelf and sign it. There's going to be some tweaks, but regardless, I don't think Mr. Jewell wants to be that limited either, but that's fine. I have no further questions and I'm finished with this witness.
Okay. Objection withdrawn then?
Yeah,
That's fair.
I'll withdraw.
Thank you. Okay. Mr. Brown, do you have any questions for this witness?
No questions. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioners, any questions for this witness? Commissioner Pinocci?
Thank you, Madam Chair. All right, I'm reading here, Mr. Jewell, the purpose of your testimony is to introduce Greenfield Irrigation District to the commission, explain the history, the aspects, discuss several of the Western Energy current proposals that will negatively impact your project. I think that we need to look at the importance of producing more power in Montana, because sometimes when we go out of state to get it, when we don't have enough of it, you agree that you understand that sometimes we pay a heck of a lot more in that situation.
That's correct.
If you were to produce power, one of the benefits, goals of the Public Service Commission, safe, reliable, and affordable, it's fair to say that if you could save us money, because you'll be producing energy all the time with this project, that could save millions of dollars to the Montana ratepayer. Do you agree with that?
I believe that our facilities represent reliable and predictable energy production, when we're operating our normal operating seasons. And as far as the cost, having the fixed avoided cost schedule, that is tremendous value to the ratepayers, because that's a known. What electricity is going to cost today and 20 years from now that I am going to produce. Nobody in this room can tell me what the price of electricity is going to be a week from now, a month from now, or 20 years from now. But with a fixed avoided cost contract, there is certainty of what you're going to pay, and there's value in that to the rate producers, as you mentioned. If I may, Commissioner Panucci, if you were to buy a house and obtain a mortgage, and you go into the bank and you say, you're going to, borrow $500,000 for a house, but the bank tells you, well, we don't, here's the interest rate today. We don't know what it's going to be over the 30-year term of your mortgage. We don't know what your payments are going to be from month to month to month. You don't know if you can afford that house a year from now. So that's the value of having fixed rates. That certainty provides comfort, knowing you're going to get this electricity, it's going to cost this much for the next 20 years. That's the value, and that's the value of having a fixed mortgage.
There's some other value that you and I have discussed. We had a meeting several years ago in Augusta. Northwestern was there. Bob Rowe himself was there. We all talked, you and I and Bob Rowe. Augusta was struggling with power.
Brownouts.
We felt that if we could connect a turbine to Gibson Reservoir, this would shore up power, which could be connected to Northwest Energy. And you and Bob Rowe and I talked about that. We felt that would be a benefit. Do you agree with that and remember that?
Well, and I'm not a transmission engineer, of that sort, electrical, but providing more diversity in generation and the reliability and predictability of local generation, in theory, has to provide better service to local people.
The word healthier grid came up in that meeting. And if we could bring power in from that end, instead of trying to get power all the way to Augusta, we could bring it from Augusta. The grid would be healthier. Do you agree with that as one of the benefits?
Yes, our proposed projects actually are feeding electricity from the other end of the grid. They're pushing electricity the other direction. So in essence, you're backfeeding the grid. And as you mentioned, as far as the overall capacity of the grid, what that allows, it frees up capacity on the grid, because you're not bringing electricity up from Great Falls to satisfy local needs. It's being generated locally.
You were able to procure transmission line between Gibson Reservoir to Augusta, and that's nearly complete.
To date, we have cooperated with Sun River Electric, the rural electric co-op. We have contributed materials and and money. They have upgraded their line. We have upgraded it to over 16 miles of 69 kV with the 3-phase underbuild. And that line is intended to serve the 3 megawatt sites that I mentioned, as well as Gibson, which is between 15 and 30, depending on how we size the turbines.
Talking a little bit about drought. With 200 years of this country being in place, some years have less rain than others. Bring it up as an issue is something we have to deal with every year in irrigation, in crops. Wouldn't you say we have plenty of experience with years with rain and years with less rain, years with too much rain due to our experience with, say, the 64 flood, which put flood waters 5 feet over the top of the dam, right? It's not a matter if that's going to happen. It's a matter of when. Why do you think the issue of drought comes up when we have 200 years of experience with that? And the Sun River has never not ran water through the river. Is that correct?
Well, that's correct. I mean, drought is a cyclic event. It happens. I'm not sure why there's so much discussion about adding one word into the force majeure paragraph about drought. But, you know, if you think about if drought impacts Gibson, it's also going to impact the 5 dams in Great Falls. I mean, it's not going to be just a little drought, you know, locally. So I hope
just
I
think
answered
it's
your
worth
question.
bringing up. The word drought here, I think, is maybe it's being misused. 200 years of experience. We're going to have years with some rain, more rain, less rain. That's just a fact of life, and we deal with it. But the river has always flowed. I've been there 2 generations. But another benefit that I think has to be brought up, which isn't being talked about, is if we put a turbine at Gibson, we will stop all the flooding, or I believe we'll stop it all, which has caused millions of dollars of damage between Gibson and Great Falls. Farmers have been able to get insurance, but they'd rather have the crop. The wellheads where we pump water out of the river are damaged. Insurance covers millions of dollars of coverage on those wellheads. My property floods, right? So if we were able to stop the flooding, the benefit between Gibson and Great Falls would be in the millions of dollars of insurance savings and flood savings, and it's the safe, reliable, and affordable goal. And it's really difficult not to talk about that as a benefit, because it is.
That would be a side benefit of the full development of Gibson or hydropower.
Flooding affects the electrical grid, power poles, some electrical problems after a flood. Would you agree?
It could.
It does. Yeah. Fact. All right. So we talk a little bit about your question in the event you're not able to produce energy.
Right.
Then we have to get the energy somewhere else. There's damage. You may be responsible for that. But here's a question I have. If you're able to stop the flooding or prevent us paying 10 times more buying electricity out of state, shouldn't you get a credit for that?
Well, I don't think the QF process acknowledges those additional benefits, but certainly as we look at the development of Gibson, we will probably approach the state of Montana and look at these benefits as being beneficial to everybody in the watershed, downstream to Great Falls. And, you know, a lot of ratepayers in Montana that have to dump resources and money, you know, to counteract flooding response vehicles and emergency personnel. So there would be a benefit to the state. So we would probably try to parlay that advantage into some maybe attractive low interest financing for our project.
My phone started ringing about an hour after yesterday's meeting. I think the last phone call was 2 a.m. and I've started at about 5 this morning. And I've got people screaming at me saying they've got to understand the benefits that are far outweighing any negativeness in case your system goes down, especially if we're able to have a qualifying facility, prevent us from paying 10 times more, bringing that money out of state. Here's something that came up last night. When we got to go out of state to get money, when we have to pay money for power, this commission has no control on setting the price. But if the power is produced in Montana, this commission has power to set the price. So that's a savings for Montana. But there's more than that. When our money that I have no control on what we spend goes out of state, that money goes out of state and stays out of state. Qualifying facility in Montana keeps the money in Montana. Would you agree that's a benefit to Montana?
For our situation, that is true. Again, we're looking at, when we have to replace these critical infrastructures, we're looking at taking the time and effort and money and converting them into hydropower ready or hydropower, conversion. The idea is that then they produce a revenue stream to the district, which then helps. We're faced with a daunting task of overhauling our plus 100-year-old system and modernizing it. And it's between $70 and $80 million to do that over the next 30 years. And we can't do that on the backs of our producers. And there isn't really enough state and federal programs to take advantage of them. Most of those programs still require 50-50 match. So the revenue stream is important. The irrigation district is recognized as a public benefit in several locations in state statutes. And the economics of the region, the source of food, just goes on and on. So, the size of the district is incredible, and the problems we're facing are also enormous. And so the revenue stream, and that's why the board has gone this direction, the revenue stream is critical to making that happen. And so, yes, the money does stay in Montana.
If you were a commissioner, what question would you ask today to yourself?
Why am I a commissioner? I don't know how I'd answer that.
What would you like to see asked that's not being asked?
Well, again, to me, the big thing is what they want to pay for the electricity as it's being produced and delivered, which, everybody thinks, oh, that sounds fair. That sounds logical. For, my mortgage analogy, that isn't going to work. And like I said, it's the death nail for small QFs because it hits the heart and soul of the project development, which is financing. And nobody's going to lend money to a project where you have that much uncertainty. When I develop a project, I've got costs. I've got development costs, engineering costs, construction costs, and then annual O&M costs after startup. That has to be offset with revenue in some short time frame. But if you can't tell me what my revenue stream looks like, I can't even be sure I have a feasible project. And if I don't have a feasible project, I don't have financing. And to me, that's the objective. The corporate objective is to knock the projects out at the knees by eliminating financing. Truthfully, if a QF or even a small QF was up for renewal, then you could look at maybe the LMP method because the capital costs are taken care of. Now you're just talking about sustaining the the project. And it might work under that scenario. And I'm talking about small QFs. Large QFs probably could absorb that LMP method because they're bigger. But small QFs, they will be the death knell.
Thank you. No more questions. I think that was a great answer, certainly.
Commissioner, you want to turn your mic off? Thank you. Okay, are there any questions from Commissioner O'Donnell or?
Madam Jim?
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. Thank you. So earlier, a question was asked of an earlier witness whether or not Greenfield had put in any, attempted to make any definition of drought. And the implication, it seemed to me, the implication was if you're not going to define it, you're just going to leave the word in there that is unworkable, lack of definition on the whole thing. And the question I was asked of Northwestern, did Northwestern attempt to define that? So what we're lacking here is the definition. As I think you pointed out, none of the other terms in force majeure were defined either, and they're taken as a flood. What constitutes a flood, and when does it become a force majeure or just an occurrence? And I think that the point was made earlier that all of these terms, they're very strong history of what they mean, and they're taken in the context of when any of these things occur that materially affect the production, in this case, of electricity or the functioning of the system. So it seems to me that these are not just terms that are left out in the middle of no place that need definition, but they could be useful to have definition, but they come with a very rich history of meaning and understanding. So having said that, and the point that counsel for Northwestern made about the drought is always occurring at some time, flooding occurs also. And there's very minor and major where it would cause a declaration of a state of emergency, as we saw in Red Lodge and in Yellowstone a couple of years ago. So it seems to me that this is a red herring. Would you? I know you've commented on that. Would you expand your comments now on that force majeure and how it's used? The term drought is used on there.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner. Well, just to go back, the process, I reviewed the PPA. Of course, as my counselor pointed out, there, I had a PPA that was specific to GID, and then there was discussions about some kind of global off-the-shelf PPA, or at least this boilerplate starting point. So when I look at force majeure, I saw all of those, and they seem like they list everything under the sun. And of course, when you're dealing with hydropower, it just popped into my head. I said, well, why aren't we talking about drought? That would be one of the most important climatic, acts that nobody has control over that could impact my ability to satisfy the contract. So I just asked my counselor to put that word in as well, not realizing it would cause such consternation. But I would agree with you that, the only time we're going to claim force majeure and drought is if we fail to satisfy our annual production projections or whatever contractual obligation is in the PPA. And in order for us to support that claim, we would have to support it with documentation, climatic records, snowpack, rainfall, the governor's drought advisory information. So it would be supported. It wouldn't just be a flippant claim, say, oh, we had drought, that's why we couldn't, deliver. we'd have to obviously support it with some kind of documentation. So that's my thoughts, Commissioner.
Thank you very much. And I can see that your activity on the Governor's Drought Advisory Committee is very directly having to do with how it would affect your business operations. So you have a keen insight into that. Thank you very much. That's the end of my questions.
Madam Chair, just to clarify, I'm not an official member of the Governor's Drought Advisory Board. I have participated in their meetings and their Zoom calls. I'm not an official member.
Thank you for the clarification. We appreciate that. All right, are there any other commissioner questions limited to the scope of testimony admitted to the record for this witness? All right, I have a couple questions. One in particular, beginning of your statement, you basically characterized what Northwestern's proposing as would be the death knell for QF1s. Are you speaking about the PPA, the power purchase agreement?
Madam Chair, their latest filing, there's two components to it. The pricing method is definitely the death knell, and I hate to keep using that over and over, but it's going to be critically detrimental to QF1 developments, small QFs, I should say, small QFs, because it will be difficult to get financing.
I understand. I think you've explained that
Okay.
very clearly.
And then the other side of it is the one-sidedness of the PPA, and it just seems to be constantly introducing opportunities for risk and fear and uncertainty. And when the PPA, and I had a draft PPA, my first small QF, I got a loan from the state of Montana Department of Commerce, and they looked at the PPA, and they looked at our feasibility, they looked at our revenue generation, because they're issuing a revenue bond. And so the bond can only be paid back by revenue from the project. So there's a direct connection. And if the LMP method was part of that draft PPA that I had submitted to Department of Commerce, they would have said, you have no certainty on revenue. We can't lend you money. And so, yes, that's why I brought that up.
Okay, I understand. There was a section here that dealt with the frequency of when the costs are calculated on this LMP process, and it was I think stated it was either your testimony, I think it was your testimony, that the 5-minute interval would be very problematic, and Northwestern rebutted that they've proposed a 15-minute interval of recording payments or costs. So that's instead of 12 times an hour, which is I think what you were asserting, it's now 4 times an hour. Is that helpful? Does that help alleviate some of that concern about the administrative burden?
Well, the administrative burden isn't necessarily the frequency of data points, although that was highlighted. It's just the staff and the knowledge of what it constitutes. I wasn't even aware of this Casio method and all of the other factors. Before we had this voided cost rate sheet, which is why we started all of our projects, it said, you generate this electricity for this period of time, and this is what we will pay you. And it was pretty straightforward. Now, if I have to hire staff or spend my time double checking what Northwestern says the prices were at those 15-minute intervals over the course of production, I would, it's going to be time consuming to double check that. We might have to hire an accountant or something to double check that.
If the basis was hourly, would you need to double check that? Ooh,
If it was yearly, that might be easier for us, but I think it's a specious argument because we would never get to that point if I can't get the project off the ground. There would be no reason to look at 15-minute or hourly data points if there's no project to produce energy.
okay. All right, that's all I have. Are there questions from staff?
Madam Chair,
Oh.
could I ask an additional question, follow up on your questions?
Yes, name.
Is it, do you have any knowledge that would it be something that could be automated, computerized to do the checking every 15 minutes or whatever period of time, that it wouldn't require a staff person to be doing that manually? Is that possible?
Well, my limited exposure to Casio when the site was up and available for me, I believe there's way to access data, real-time data and historic data. I mean, we put a man on the moon, that should be available, I would imagine. Like I say, I didn't download any data myself, but I believe the data would be there, both in real time and historic.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions from commissioners? Are there any questions from commission staff? Mr. Pokel?
Good morning, Mr. Jewell.
Good morning, Counselor.
I know you were here yesterday, but my name's Dan Poco. I'm a staff attorney here at the Public Service Commission.
Yes, Counselor.
Could you please reference your exhibit EAJ2?
Which one, please?
EAJ2, which I believe is
Yes.
your proposed PPA, correct?
I have it here.
We'll start with, so correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of your testimony that you filed was discussing why you made certain additions, correct? To Northwestern's proposed PPA.
Yeah, and again, just to reiterate the process, I had some exposure as we developed our PPA with this current filing. I looked at the opportunity of looking at, what they proposed for modifying and updating the PPA. And so my comments, again, I'm not a lawyer, so my comments were more observances, suggestions, concerns, and then my legal staff then addressed those with the legalese.
Thank you. Starting on page 8. In section 3.4, and let me know when you're there. In section 3.4, labeled construction of facility, you proposed edits to the PPA, correct?
Say that again, please.
In section 3.4 of exhibit EAJ2, in that section 3.4 labeled construction of facility, you proposed edits to the PPA.
Oh,
correct?
Yes, edits, yes.
Why did you propose those specific edits?
Well, again, what we've experienced with our project that's going right now, and you heard some testimony yesterday to this effect, the pandemic and the war in Europe has caused tremendous supply issues with big industrial or electrical components, large transformers, meters, breakers, on and on and on. And so we're looking at maybe, talking about some of those concerns that we have no control over, impacting the construction of the facility, and, you know, being online when we want to be online.
Would you agree, though, that the edit that you made does not concern being able to procure resources? It's about just the increase or decrease to the nameplate capacity without prior written consent of Northwestern. And then
On
you've
three-
added a parenthetical after that.
On 3.4,
Correct.
don't see anything about nameplates. You talk about nameplate capacity?
Can I point you to the sentence?
Article 3, Section 3.4, construction of facility.
Correct.
Which line?
In line
3?
5, the sentence starting in line 5.
The seller shall notify Northwestern of any change in the manufacture of the HTG and shall not increase or decrease nameplate capacity without prior written consent of Northwestern. Such consent not to be unreasonably withheld, conditioned, or delayed.
So I believe your answer went to timelines about procuring resources to construct the facility. However, I was asking why you made this edit to that concerns the written consent of Northwestern concerning increases or decreases to nameplate capacity. I'll ask again, why did you make that specific edit?
Well, and I have to go back and look at my original notes, and obviously I'm the point person on this, and there may have also been some input from the other intervener on this project, hydrodynamics. But it just sounded like it was an area where there could be some concern that required further delineation on the verbiage.
Okay, thank you. Turning to page 9 in section 3.5, labeled operation of facility, you proposed similar edits to the PPA, correct?
Yes, and I would assume that the same intent, trying to be consistent with the language.
Thank you. On page 18 in section 7.4, and the top reads alternative red lines if the commission does not strike delay damages in total. You made some edits for, correct?
I'm going to object to this. The alternative red lines were struck in the data response.
Yeah. And
I'll pull up which data response if you'd like. That what you were going to ask me? Might take a moment.
Counselor, I was just going to clarify that they were stricken. It's
Okay, fair enough. You can, I'll withdraw.
Thank you.
and I apologize, the copy I have is black and white. There's no red on it, so it's a little difficult to discern.
Thank you. For clarity, though, for the clarity of the record, you revoked the proposed edits because your sole position is that delay damages should be stricken in total, correct?
That's our starting point for negotiation. Again, we're not comfortable saying that the damages are real. We want to definitely strike penalties if damages are legit. I think there's, that could be subject to negotiation.
Thank you. On page 19, in section 8.1.2, Romanet IV, you propose that it's to the PPA, correct?
Eight point one, sir?
8.1.1, or sorry, 8.1.2, Romanet IV.
Okay.
You propose that it's to the PPA, correct?
If you give me a chance to read it. Okay. Sometimes I get a little confused because I have my project specific PPA in my head. And this is the proposed boilerplate going forward. So you had a question on which of on one of the specific proposed changes?
Section 8.1.2, Romanet IV. You propose edits to the PPA. Is that correct?
That appears correct.
And why did you propose those changes?
Well, again, just to, I'll have to go back and look at my testimony. Is it addressed in the testimony? Okay. Then I would have to go back and look at my original notes of what my concerns were. And this may not necessarily have been my concern. It may have been my co-intervener.
Thank you.
Madam Chair, are you able to pull up the actual exhibit on the screen here? Because I think it'd be a lot easier for the witness to see the red line. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have colored printer, so I think that's part of the difficulty with this process for the witness.
Let's take a 5-minute recess to take care of that. So we will go off the record. The time is 9:57 a.m. and we will be back on in about 5 minutes. We are now back on the record. The time is 10:05 a.m. And Mr. Polko, you might want to offer to, now that this is up on the screen for the witness to see, you might want to offer to go back to some of your other questioning too, so that he can put his answers in context with the document you've been referring to.
Perfect. Thank you. We'll start on page 22 and 23. Good. In sections 9.5.2 and 9.5.3, all under the label of limitations of liability, remedies, and damages. You proposed edits to the PPA, correct?
That's correct.
And based on your own personal knowledge, why did you propose those changes?
Well, that's not necessarily my own personal knowledge. Again, this is a collective effort with other interveners and, advice of counsel on, other QF projects. Obviously, I'm not a lawyer, and dealing with limitations, liability, this may have been triggered by one of my comments. I can't remember from my notes.
Okay.
But
Thank-
let me read the sentence. It says, provided that nothing in this sentence limits seller's right to claim lost profits from sales of energy that result from a Northwestern event of default. So I think that was probably submitted on advice of counsel.
Let me just make sure the sentence was fully read into the record.
Certainly.
Mr. Joel, you skipped over the second to last sentence there, so where the second to last part of that sentence, where the capacity or environmental attribute.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. You want me to reread it?
For the sake of the record, please, if you could please reread that. However, the record is clear of what the contract says, correct?
Correct.
We'll move on. I'll turn to 14.1 labeled force majeure and continue the discussion with drought quickly. When you were speaking with the Council for Northwestern, you mentioned there are different types of drought, correct?
Different severities.
And would you agree that the type or severity of the drought would make a difference to whether, in your opinion, the drought constitutes a force majeure?
Yes.
And also, when you were speaking with Council for Northwestern, you said that Montana generally has had drought for some time now. Some severity of drought during the past several years, correct?
It also varies across the state. Some areas are unimpacted by drought, and some areas can have experienced severe drought. So it could be severity, it could be geographically occurring, and then in 3 years, there could be no drought anywhere in the state. It's just the way it occurs.
In your opinion, do you believe drought would be covered by the provision in section 14.1 that states, quote, similar cataclysmic occurrences or other unusual natural calamities?
I agree, but why list all the others? And then I agree. I know for sure that this was my comment because, looking at all those acts of which I have no control over, in my world, it just seemed like drought was an obvious one that wasn't on the list. And I agree with you. We could argue later that it should be listed under that and other similar cataclysmic occurrences. But if it's listed up front, then you don't have to argue about it later.
Thank you. In section 15.1.1 labeled payment disputes, you proposed edits to the PPA, correct?
That's correct.
To the best of your knowledge in preparing this document, why did you propose those changes?
Those may have been suggestions from a fellow intervener or on advice of counsel.
Thank you. One last further line of questions. Can you please, we could keep the EAJ2 up. Can you also turn to page 25 of your pre-filed testimony?
I'm sorry.
Page 25 of your pre-filed testimony.
Oh, of the testimony?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. I have it here somewhere. Page 25? Yes,
Correct.
sir. Yes, sir.
And under the first full question on there, you discuss that you'd like the commission to follow the decision in CED Wheatland v. Montana PSC concerning the proportional use of network upgrades that add capacity.
That's
Correct.
correct, as that was explained to me by counsel.
Okay. But generally, are you familiar with the decision in that case?
I am now.
And turning quickly to section 6.3 of EAJ2, and specifically on page 15.
Which section, sir?
Section 15, or sorry, page 15, section 6.3. That section goes over 2 pages. It's on both 14 and 15, but the
It's section 6.3?
correct. On the bottom of section 6.3, can you read the red line edits?
The last sentence?
Correct.
If applicable and consistent with commission regulations and orders, Montana law and federal law, Northwestern will reimburse seller the costs related to network upgrades.
Great. And again, you've reviewed the commission's decision in CED Wheatland that was referenced in your pre-filed testimony?
I did not review the decision as a lawyer would review a decision. I looked at what, just those few snippets that were provided.
Are you familiar with how the commission treated refunds in that decision?
Not exactly, sir.
No further questions.
Okay, does any party wish to recross the witness following commission and staff questions?
I have a couple of questions, Madam Chair.
Ms. Hill?
Mr. Jewell, you said a couple of times that hydrodynamics helped to provide comments on the power purchase agreement.
That's my assumption. They are a co-intervener and they have experience with these documents. And again, so it's my assumption that they have provided input.
Is there a hydrodynamics witness here today that's going to testify about their input?
I don't think so, no.
Okay. And we're talking about a purchase power agreement, right? That's the contract we're talking about.
That's correct.
And Northwestern is the purchaser of the power, right?
That's correct.
And so Northwestern is the one that will be making the payments in the contract, right?
That's correct.
That's all. I have no further questions.
Okay, would, Mr. Chandler, would you like to redirect?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Oh, excuse me, Mr. Brown, did you want an opportunity?
No, thank you, Madam Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chandler?
Give me, just a moment. Yeah, I'm not sure. That's right in my notes. A million different things. Okay. So, Mr. Jewell, Ms. Hill at the beginning discussed a revenue stream and auditing and things that Northwestern has to do. It's correct that, GID is a governmental entity
That's correct.
and everything GID does is public?
It's public and we are also audited annually. And then federally, we're also audited because we are recipients of larger grants and loan programs.
Um, let's go into, this issue of force majeure. 14.1, the drought. The discussion about the word drought. So does Greenfields or any other QF for that matter have an incentive to claim force majeure? I mean, is there a reason you would just willy-nilly claim force majeure unless you absolutely had to?
Well, speaking for GID, I mean, obviously, we built a power plant. We want to generate electricity. That's the whole goal. We want to do that. So there are situations that we have no control over. And so that does provide protection for us. But I mean, we wouldn't use force majeure unless we could not contractually meet our obligations to produce energy because of one of those events.
And that's because you don't get paid during a force majeure event, correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, we wouldn't claim drought if we weren't able to meet our objectives. I mean, if the drought caused a reduction in output, then you probably could look at then, okay, now we're dealing with severity drought because it's not there's no water at all, so there's no energy, but maybe the drought has impacted the normal generation output. And that's well established after, most of our canals, we have 100 years worth of data. We can tell you what we run every year historically. So it would be statistically possible to evaluate whether you're in a drought impacted event.
And there's some discussion about why GID or QF interveners didn't suggest a definition of drought. Was Northwestern the entity that originally drafted and submitted the proposed PPAs in this docket?
Yes, I think that's part of their initial filing.
So it's fair to say this is a Northwestern created document.
To start with.
So to try to imply that that GID or QF intervener should be faulted for not providing a specific definition of drought is a bit unfair.
Objection, Northwestern didn't propose adding drought to the contract.
I'll withdraw. But Northwestern proposed had the word flood in there and all these other terms that are undefined, correct, in 14.1?
Yes, those events have variability associated with them.
You had some questions from Commissioner Pinochi. And there's a mention about Sun River's flow. Even if Sun River is flowing, can you explain whether or not that means water would always be in the Pishkin Supply Canal?
Well, for the majority of our planned QFs, they are off stream and they are part of our water supply or water distribution system. And they are fed by storage primarily from Gibson Reservoir, which is on the river itself, the Sun River, which receives its water, from basically the Bob Marshall Wilderness, the watershed. And so we operate off of storage and we divert water. We release water out of Gibson Dam, and then a couple miles downstream, we divert it into our supply canal, which we call the PSC, just the Pishkin Supply Canal. And the drought, the river could have water in it and we could experience drought-like conditions. And that would be readily apparent from USGS data in the region. But when we operate the PSC, the Pishkin Supply Canal, it typically runs wide open and at full capacity until our storage is depleted. And a drought condition would cause the reservoir to be drafted quicker than normal because the inflows would not be sufficient to keep up with the withdrawals or to attenuate the withdrawals, the drafting of the reservoir. So when our reservoir hits our winter levels, the Pishkin Supply Canal cuts off. So that's how the drought would impact it, even though there would be water in the river.
You also discussed with Commissioner Pinochi the importance of a fixed cost, and that it's a tremendous benefit to ratepayers. You made a comment that no one could tell you, what the rates would be 1 week, month, years. Would you say that it's correct to say that it would be no one can tell you with absolute certainty what those forecasted rates would be?
Yeah, they're variable. Nobody can guarantee them. A avoided cost rate schedule is a guarantee. I produce this energy, I get paid this much. It's a guarantee. So having, not being able to predict the price of that energy over the length of the PPA is a huge risk and a huge uncertainty. I didn't create the avoided cost fixed rate schedule. That was done by the PSC, and Northwestern. I'm just using it for my projects. And I heard testimony yesterday that historically, they overpay for electricity. Well, then do a better job forecasting. Don't penalize the QFs for that. So, for example, I believe that if you were more accurate in your prediction, for example, if the price was estimated to be a little bit lower, then the QF developer could say, is my project feasible or not at that? It still has certainty and there's a fixed number over the length of the PPA. It's still something they can determine overall feasibility. But that's the starting point. So, I mean, I understand Northwestern and the PSC, they have energy forecasting experts. That's all they do is think about the price of energy over the life, in the future, world events, trends, so on and so forth. I rely on them to tell me what that energy is worth over a 20-year span. And that's all I ask. You come up with a number, it's fixed, and it's up to me whether I want to do it or not at that number. Did I get sidetracked?
Yeah, no, thank you. So let's go into the PPA, starting with 3.4. Okay, can you see the red line there?
Yes, sir.
Such consent not to be unreasonably withheld, conditioned, or delayed.
Mr. Chandler, please be sure to speak clearly for the recorder.
Apologies.
Thank you.
So with this revision, GID isn't looking to exceed the 3 megawatt or other QF interveners to exceed the 3 megawatt QF-1 limitation. Is that right?
No, we're building our sites to be in compliance with, with the requirements of the PPA and PURPA. I mean, if we're going to get the advantages and benefits of a small QF, we're going to be at 3 megawatts or less. But, there could be modifications. Generator might have to be replaced and put a new generator. All of a sudden it puts out 3.05. And there may be before, we might have to have some opportunity, some time before you can figure out how to get that throttle back down into your 3 megawatt range. There are fluctuations in all the systems, obviously. So if we're right at 3.0, sometimes we'll be at 2.8, sometimes we'll be at 3.1. I just have to imagine, and again, this is my first power plant, but there's obviously probably some fluctuations. Our generators and our analysis and our designs are for a 3 megawatt system. The nameplates on the generators that we're getting, we haven't installed them yet. They actually say there's 2 of them. There's 1,500 kilowatts. So that's 3 megawatts. So.
And just to be clear, you are not intending to operate your plant above the 3 megawatt threshold.
No.
And so you talked about lead times, and I think this got a little lost. So I want to make sure you have a chance to clarify. You mentioned lead times and equipment shipment when you had this discussion with the staff attorney, Mr. Polko. Speaking of QF projects generally, not necessarily GID's project, could there be an instance where you've ordered a turbine, but then something happens and you have to order a different one from a different manufacturer and you've already executed your PPA?
Are you saying that would impact startup?
That would impact the nameplate capacity, a decrease or a slight increase?
Well, the turbine turns the generator and the generator has a rating. I suppose there's a factor of safety built in the generator. If the turbine put out more, the generator would put out more. But again, we control the flow, we control the head. But yeah, if there were some equipment changes, there may be a time where we put out 3.0 before we, made the correction to get it back into that 3 megawatt ceiling.
Or if you were a project was a 2.5 nameplate originally, and then it had to order a new turbine because there was a supply chain disruption, for the originally chosen turbine, you know, it could bump up to 2.7. Is that fair to say?
Well, yeah,
Or go down to 2.4 or 3?
yeah, those are all variables that could be entertained, that could be realized, I should say.
Okay, and can we jump down to 8.1.2 Romanet 4? Moment. So Romanet 4 discusses a material obligation. The reason that 3.4 provided the additional language of such consent not to be unreasonably withheld, conditioned, or delayed was so that if a QF intervener, a QF project had a slight change that impacted nameplate capacity, should Northwestern be able to terminate the PPA? Is that fair?
Well, no, and in this case, it's subject to a 30-day cure period, but that's important because, like I say, on paper, you have the flow, you have the driving head through the turbine, which produces the energy. Then you have a bunch of assumed efficiencies on everything. So in reality, you're not quite exactly sure what the output's going to be until you start doing it. I mean, what they say is one test is worth 1,000 opinions. So, but the intent out of the chute is not to violate the conditions either of the original 556 or the PPA. So that would be part of that. Okay, you know, on the first week we're doing 3.2. Well, we got a problem. So we'll have to adjust flow, adjust head to get back into that compliance.
And if you can jump back up to 3.5, the same language. I apologize that I have to go through this, but
And to answer
3.5.
to address your earlier question, you know, a replacement part, a new generator or something on the turbine or something could also affect the efficiencies and the overall output. So,
And so that discussion that we just had also applies to the changes recommended here in 3.5 regarding such consent not to be unreasonably withheld, conditioned, or delayed. Do you agree with that? It's the same reasoning.
yes.
All right, let's jump down to 7.4 delay damages. And let me ask you a more general question here. You mentioned that there are other interveners in this docket, hydrodynamics, that may have had some input in your exhibit EAJ2. Do you disagree with any of the suggested changes that were made in your exhibit?
No, I do not, even though they may have not come from the end of my pen as far as a comment or concern, you know, the fellow interveners and advice of counsel based on their previous experiences, you know, I would trust that as well.
But you're sponsoring these changes.
That's correct. I am the point on this.
So can you go to 7.4.2? Can you see the red lines there in 7.4.2?
Yes.
You noted in a data response that the alternative delay damages concept was struck, but are you intending to strike this language as well?
I don't believe so. This is one that impacts me because we do not operate year-round necessarily. The method of cure and the time for cure and all those things can only happen when you're actually running water through the system. So if our season is done, you know, and the 90-day window continues, there could be some kind of contractual conflict with that. Did I make myself clear?
Let's go to 9.5.2. You're asked questions on this. Fairly self-explanatory, but can you explain, why this is important?
Maybe self-explanatory for a lawyer.
Fair enough.
Whenever that goes all caps, though, you lose me. But no, I don't have a problem with this.
And can you explain that it's just intended to protect your right to pursue the appropriate amount of damages in the event of a default by Northwestern?
Well, under the sections of, limitation, remedies, and damages, that would be our protection against Northwestern.
All right. I think that finishes the PPA. I don't know, did I miss anything? Oh, maybe 15.11. So if there's a dispute between Northwestern and a QF-1 project, do you feel that the suggested, can you explain your rationale for this addition and why it provides more clarity for how disputes should be handled?
Well, basically what it says is just the amount payable by Northwestern or the seller under this, here, okay, the party liable for such amount shall pay the undisputed amount to the other party pursuant to the terms of the agreement. So,
But do you feel like if there's a dispute, you should be paid the amount that you are actually owed? Yeah.
I do. I
Not
mean,
the undisputed amount?
that's correct. I mean, there's methods for settling disputes outside the contract. I mean,
And so in the event you go through that one of those methods, you've already received payment, you would, if the result of that method resulted in Greenfields or any other QF being overpaid, that amount would be then given back to Northwestern.
if we were overpaid, then it doesn't belong to us. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yes,
But if Northwestern disputes something and the undisputed amount is a underpayment of what you were otherwise owed, you think it's fair to not immediately receive what you should have been owed?
no, I think this, if I'm understanding this section, this goes back to, another type of penalty. So, it's like you pay the amount. If there's something in dispute, then that will be settled later. But to withhold it initially would be perceived like a penalty. And we're not really on, we're at the mercy of Northwestern, what they feel is a disputed claim or not.
And does GID have, a lot of resources to be held into arbitration and litigation anytime Northwestern decides it wants to raise a dispute?
No, and I can speak fairly, of small QFs, we probably fit into that category where, just intervening is a huge expense to the district in today's proceedings leading up to today. And to take on Northwestern over, disputes like this would be a huge financial issue.
All right, so we're mostly done with the PPA. So you had some discussion about network upgrades in your testimony at page 25. These provisions are in the PPA, but and the CED Wheatland case and remand. So after when Northwestern submitted its rebuttal testimony, noting that it's filing an order of compliance filing with FERC pursuant to order 2023. Did QF intervener's position change at all as a result of that?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Did QF interveners agree that complying with the language in order 2023 Northwestern's compliance filing would make sense to be applied in this docket?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Again, this is way outside my wheelhouse.
All right. I'm all done. Thank you. Thanks, Erling.
Thank you. Mr. Jewell, thank you. I temporarily excuse you. I have a little housekeeping matter, and that is this exhibit that was handed out by your co-counsel, Mr. Chandler. It's marked Exhibit QF-1. This is the same. This is just a courtesy copy, I assume, of what was already admitted into the record as QF-1. Is that correct?
Correct. If you're asking if it's a copy of what has already been filed? Is that your
Yes.
question?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Chandler, how many more witnesses do you have today?
Just one.
Okay, I think what we'll do is take a 15-minute break. So it's now 10:44, and we will go to recess here, and we will reconvene at 11 a.m. We are now off the record. Time is 11:01 a.m. and we are back on the record to continue this hearing. Mr. Chandler, you may call your next witness.
QF interveners call Mr. Roger Schiffman. And he's appearing remotely on Zoom. Good morning, Roger.
Good morning.
Can you please state and spell your name for the record?
I think
Oh, yes.
swear him in.
We talked about this. Roger, you're gonna need to be sworn in.
Yes.
All right, good morning, Mr. Schiffman.
Good morning.
Please raise your right hand. Please stand. And do you swear the testimony you are about to give is the truth and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chandler?
All right. Thanks, Madam Chair. Mr. Schiffman, can you please state and spell your name for the record?
It's Roger Schiffman, ROGERSCHIFFMAN.
And who are you employed by and in what capacity?
I'm working as an independent consultant.
Did you submit pre-filed testimony in this docket?
Yes, I did.
And do you have that testimony before you?
Yes.
Is the name of that testimony, the first portion, updated intervener testimony of Roger Schiffman on behalf of QF interveners?
Yes.
And was that submitted on March 15th, 2024?
Yes, I believe so.
Do you have any corrections to that updated testimony?
None that I'm aware of now.
If I were to ask you the same questions here today, would your responses be the same?
Yes.
Madam Chair, I move to admit the stated testimony and accompanying attachments as Exhibit QFI 2.
No objection.
No objection.
QFI 2 is admitted.
Mr. Schiffman, did you also submit pre-filed intervener supplemental testimony of Roger Schiffman on behalf of Greenfields Irrigation District and Hydrodynamics, Inc.?
Yes.
And was that submitted on July 26, 2024?
Yes, I believe so.
And do you have any corrections to that testimony?
Again, none that I'm aware of.
And if I were to ask you the same questions here today, would your responses be the same?
Yes.
Madam Chair, I move to admit the stated testimony and accompanying attachments as Exhibit QFI 3.
No objection.
No objection.
QFI 3 is admitted.
Madam Chair, I tender this witness for cross-examination.
Ms. Hill?
Good morning, Mr. Schiffman.
Good morning.
You calculated the fixed cost for Yellowstone County Generating Station, or YCGS, to use as what we refer to as the proxy cost of capacity, correct?
I did based on some testimony that Northwestern had submitted in a previous rate case, yes.
And you used 175 megawatt nameplate for that calculation, didn't you?
Yes, I believe so.
And when you were evaluating Northwestern's capacity forecast, you used 165 megawatts for Yellowstone, didn't you?
Well, for Yellowstone, I believe I used whatever was in the spreadsheets or work papers provided by Northwestern initially, so I didn't make a revision to the capacity numbers that were presented in that data for Yellowstone.
So it's possible you used 175 megawatts in one instance and 165 megawatts in another instance.
Yeah, that's possible. The calculation for capacity using the 175 is really just to come up with the avoided capacity costs. So I think nameplate is an appropriate number. In the other spreadsheet, I'm assuming that that's more of a reserve capacity number that probably was vetted by the RAP entities.
And you stated that when you were calculating the fixed costs, you adopted the revenue requirement from some Northwestern testimony, correct?
That's correct.
And that revenue requirement included the cost for transmission, interconnection, and network upgrades, didn't it?
I don't believe so. I made a separate calculation for the network upgrade costs.
So then it's true, if Northwestern had already included it, when you made a separate calculation, it could have accidentally got double counted then, correct?
If those costs were included in Northwestern's revenue requirement, then yes, that's possible.
You don't dispute that the Yellowstone County Generating Station can provide flexible and dispatchable capacity, energy, grid regulation services, and ancillary services, do you?
No, I don't.
And you don't dispute that that same facility can provide market sales, do you?
When Northwestern is in a surplus position or when it's economic, yes, it could provide market sales.
And isn't it true that Northwestern did not receive a carbon adder or an added cost of carbon for its 2 Spion-Cop and Judith Gap wind facilities?
Northwestern did not receive a carbon adder. I'm not completely following the premise of that question. I'm sorry.
Northwestern did not, is not recovering additional cost for those wind facilities avoiding a cost of carbon. Is that correct?
I mean, that's not something that I've specifically looked at. That sounds probably correct.
Thank you, Mr. Schiffman. That's all the questions I have.
Mr. Brown, any questions for this witness?
No questions. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move to commissioner questions. Are there any commissioner questions for this witness?
No, thank you.
Okay, and there are no commission staff questions for this witness. Mr. Chandler, do you wish to redirect?
I just, thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple. Mr. Schiffman, are you aware of any avoided cost of carbon or additional cost for carbon in Northwestern's acquisition of various hydro dams?
I'm aware that there was, as I understood it, sort of goodwill amount that was included when they acquired those dams, and the rationale for it was avoided carbon, yes.
And the discussion you had on the nameplate, YCGS, when you're calculating avoided capacity, is it typical to use the nameplate of a facility?
Yeah, I think it's typical. If you used a lower number or capacity accredited number, then the avoided capacity cost would actually be higher because you'd just be dividing it by a smaller quantity.
And so if the commission were to order the YCGS plant as the proxy would if network upgrade costs are included in that calculation, then it would be there would be double counting, so the additional network upgrade calculation wouldn't also be included. Is that correct?
If it were shown that that estimate that I used from Northwestern had network upgrade transmission costs built into it, which I would kind of find surprising because I would think those would be accounted for separately from Yellowstone. But if that were in it, then the additional adder that I calculated for network upgrade costs most likely would be inappropriate, yes.
Okay. But it wouldn't nullify your avoided cost calculation for the
No.
based on the YCGS.
No, I had presented avoided network upgrade costs as a separate adder to the avoided capacity costs.
Okay. Thanks, Madam Chair. That's all I have.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Schiffman, for your appearance. I excuse you.
Thank you for letting me appear remotely, Madam Chairman.
Okay, intervener, Consumer Counsel, would you like to proceed with your case in chief?
Madam Chair, Consumer Council doesn't have any witnesses, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Okay, we're now at the end of the hearing. Would the parties wish to present a brief closing statement? We'll go with Northwestern Energy first.
No, thank you, Madam Chair. We'll save our closing for briefing.
Okay, QF interveners.
Madam Chair, just a couple quick points on the LMP issue. QF interveners would note that it's been presented that it's not a reliable representation of Northwestern avoided cost of energy. Northwestern is not operating in the CAISO market. They're not part of the day-ahead EDAM market. So it's an inappropriate proxy for an avoided cost of energy. But we would request the fixed calculation that was previously approved remain in place. On capacity, I think it's been very clear that while Northwestern has said they're following the RAP methodology, they're not. And in terms of carbon, the avoided cost of carbon, there's been no rebuttal by Northwestern to the calculation by Mr. Schiffman submitted in the supplemental intervener testimony in July. So that figure should be approved. And I thank you for your time and patience and look forward to the post-hearing process and the final order. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Brown?
MCC will waive closing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, the evidentiary hearing is now closed and the public comment period is again opened. I will next ask for final public comment. Is there any public comment in the room? Is there any public comment in the room? Seeing none. Is there any public comment online? Seeing none. We will move into, excuse me. All right. We will go off the record for scheduling conference. The time is now 11:16 a.m. We are off the record and we'll be back shortly after the scheduling conference. We're now back on the record. The time is 11:26 a.m. The results of the conference will now be read into the record by the commission attorney, Dan Polkel, as an order of the commission, and no separate scheduling order will be issued.
The parties agreed to file simultaneous opening briefs to be due no later than December 20th, 2024. And the parties also agreed to file simultaneous response briefs to be filed and due no later than January 24th, 2024. 2025.
Thank you, Mr. Polkel. I'd like to thank the parties too and the witnesses for your participation, your civil and cordial conduct during the hearing, and your preparation for it. And I'd like to thank commissioners and commission staff as well. For the record, the time is 11:27 a.m. and the date is October 30th, 2024, and this hearing is adjourned.